I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, unraveling the mysteries of healing. Having done this podcast for 7 years made me more curious and hungry for more information to understand true healing. When I stumbled upon Sacred Medicine, a book by today's guest, I knew I had to have her on the show. I have so many questions about healing. You hear people say, I am on a healing journey, or I have done so much healing. But what does that really mean? What does healing entail? How does one know if they indeed are healing? Are there any signs? And the things that they are engaging in are effective. What's the difference between healing and being cured? How is that some people do everything right and stay sick, while others seem to do nothing extraordinary, yet fully recover? I am hoping this episode will answer some of those questions for us. My guest today is Lissa Rankin. She's a medical doctor, a mind-body medicine physician, author of 7 books, founder of the Whole Health Medicine Institute, and mystic who researches radical remission, trauma-informed medicine, and spiritual healing. Her TEDx talks have been viewed over 5 million times, and she starred in 2 national public television specials, Heal Yourself, Mind Over Medicine, and Fear Cure. Lissa's interest in the link between loneliness and disease led her to her latest project, Heal at Last, a nonprofit organization which aims to bring effective trauma healing and spiritual healing methods to anyone ready for the deep dive of healing. In this episode, we talk about the relationship between trauma, the nervous system, and healing, discuss the concept of spiritual bypassing, and the effectiveness of IFS and somatic experiencing, energy transfusions, blind compassion, the paradoxes of healing, our 4 intelligences, the stress-disease connection, adverse childhood experiences, and developmental trauma, and much more. But before we get to today's fantastic conversation, I want to suggest a few past episodes. Episode 332, The Science of Stuck and Trauma Healing with Britt Frank. Episode 326, Befriending Your Nervous System with Deb Dana, a fantastic episode. If you haven't listened to this one, I highly recommend. Episode 311, The Healing Power of Storytelling. Episode 292, Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with Dick Schwartz. Another great episode in which the creator of IFS, Internal Family System, Dick Schwartz, answers some of my questions and does a real IFS session with me. And I have to tell you, it was pretty effective. Even though I had only 1 session, it was pretty remarkable how helpful it was. And lastly, episode 289, another favorite episode of mine, Mind-Body Tools to Develop Stress Resilience with Rebecca Ladine. And now, please enjoy this fantastic conversation with this extraordinary individual, Lissa Rankin. Lissa, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, I want to begin by asking you this question, which occurred to me right before the interview. You know, I consumed all of your content and I'm ready for the interview, but I'm like, wait, I think I'm going to start with this one. Well, given that healing is not a destination, right? It's a pathway to wholeness and it's an ongoing process. A person who is doing healing things, modalities, they're engaged in activities and they're devoted to this process. How do I know if the things I'm doing are effective? Indeed, like I am indeed healing. How do I know in my body truly that the things that I'm engaged in are effective and that I'm healing? I could be on this path, but are they signs? I know, trauma will never be healed completely, or maybe there are some diseases because of the trauma and stress, but how does one know that the healing work that they're engaged in is working?
This is such a good question. And I was just asked this by a friend yesterday. She was like, how do I know if therapy is working? And she and I were good friends, and both of us have IFS therapist, internal family systems therapy. I've been in therapy for 5 years since my mother died. And we just celebrated the 5-year anniversary of her death on October 30th. So it's like a milestone for me to be, and I've been in therapy before, but like not really good cutting edge trauma therapy. And so I'm a little ahead of my friend. I started earlier than she did. And so she was like, how do you know? Like there's no there, right? So we know there's not a destination. So it's not like I have arrived and I am now enlightened and I will never have pain again. That's a magical thinking, but it's funny because I was just drawing a little map. I know people are listening and they can't see what I'm showing you, but I was just drawing a little map of my parts, the way my system responds to something that's happening right now. And I was just telling her that the way that people start to be able to get feedback from their systems that healing is happening is that their trauma symptoms start to improve, right? It's quite that simple. So if they were depressed, they're feeling less depressed. If they were very anxious, they're feeling less anxious. If they had chronic pain, they're having less chronic pain. If they typically had a pattern of relating, for example, when somebody makes an entitled demand, I can't say no to them and I just comply and then get resentful. They start to notice, no, actually, I'm able to say no to that entitled demand and stand up for myself and get a little feisty and not have my system collapse in the presence of a narcissistic person who is expecting me to do something that I don't want to do. So we all have those patterns that we know. There's sort of like my teacher, Rachel Naomi Remen, she told me once, she said, Lissa, you want to hear the most important thing I ever learned in therapy? And I said, oh my gosh, yes, like give me the juice, give me the gold. And she said, my therapist said, Rachel, you have that thing happen and then you do your little song and dance and it's automatic. Thing happens, song and dance. She's like, the thing that therapy breaks is it breaks the automatic. The thing happens and then you can pause and you can be in choice about whether or not you do the song and dance. It's like you cut the tripwire so you can slow down, be in your body, feel your feelings, settle your nervous system, identify whatever parts are acting up inside yourself, and then pause, right? If the tripwire goes automatic and we do the song and dance, at least we can see afterwards, oh gosh, there I did it. I did my song and dance, and you're able to very quickly do the autopsy and say, oh, okay, I'm still in that automatic pattern, but look, I caught myself 2 minutes later, and now let me go back and make a repair, or let me go back and shore up that boundary, or let me go back and do something different. And it's pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome. It's really, I'm 53 years old. I feel like I kind of got to this late in the game. My daughter is 16 and she has an IFS therapist. And I was so jealous. I wish I had an IFS therapist when I was 16, because all of the pain that happens from like the decades of song and dance, right? So it's painful to sort of feel the regret of not having done this work sooner. But then at the same time, I'm so grateful that I have the privilege, because I do consider it a massive privilege. There is not good health equity around most effective healing modalities. I am so grateful for the privilege of being able to start to break the tripwire. And the benefit, this is the other thing, the other way that you can tell is that your relationships get so much better. There's so much more love. There's so much more generosity. There's so much more intimacy, safe intimacy, not unsafe intimacy. There's so much more, just kind of gentleness of spirit. There's more tenderness. It's softer. Yeah. And then you're able to sort of have what I call nervous system privilege. I got this from Steph Jagger. Nervous system privilege. Like you start to develop the capacity to have a more stabilized ventral vagal, for those of you that know polyvagal theory, ventral vagal kind of parasympathetic relaxation response, socially engaged and aware nervous system that allows there to be a whole lot of chaos outside, and it doesn't rattle you as much. Doesn't mean you don't get triggered, but you repair much more quickly. So that was a long answer.
No, I loved your answer. And I can comment on so many things, but I really want to keep quiet and ask you more questions. I want to ask you about spiritual bypassing. Before I go into other questions, I would love for you to speak to that. What is spiritual bypassing?
In general, spiritual bypassing is a term that was developed by John Welwood, who is a Buddhist psychologist and spiritual teacher, who recognized that people in spiritual communities had a tendency to use their spirituality and their spiritual beliefs as a kind of conflict avoidance and way of not feeling their pain, numbing their pain with meditation or spiritual practice or yoga or kirtan or whatever, and using that as a way to not touch their trauma. The practice of spiritual bypassing it takes a while to actually even realize what it means and how you're doing it, so that you can start to actually unpack what's underneath it. And the way that the belief systems in many religious and spiritual situations kind of collude to prevent us from actually feeling these painful things. So it's a very effective strategy. In IFS, I consider it a part. It's I say I've had a spiritual bypassing part, and man, I loved that phase. It was like I had this phase of my development I called it my bliss hunting phase, where I was just going from like one meditation retreat to the next yoga class, to the next tantra circle, to the next cacao ceremony, to the next kirtan, and the next ecstatic dance. And it felt really good because I had just come out of a series of back-to-back traumas after giving birth to my daughter. And within 2 weeks of my C-section, recovering from surgery, my dog died, my father died, my brother wound up in the hospital in full-blown liver failure. And then my daughter's father cut 2 fingers off his left hand with a table saw and had to go through multiple surgeries to try to get them replanted. And then I had all my sort of childhood trauma underneath that. So compounding all that back-to-back trauma on the trauma of my childhood, and then the trauma of being a doctor, and the moral injury of trying to be a caregiver when you're colluding with a corrupt system that gives lip service to patient well-being, but ultimately is at the mercy of the financial bottom line, and the moral injury of that. It just pushed me over the edge, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. And I became suicidal, which led me to quit my job and all kinds of other things, and move to the country and start a healing journey. And so, at the time, it was like a beautiful, beautiful time. But I look back on it and it was not benign. Not only did it waste years of not getting me the treatment that I needed, but when you start to unpack those belief systems, they're very oppressive belief systems that are not anti-racist beliefs. They're not, now that we've had sort of the reckoning of 2020, with regard to all of the marginalized and oppressed groups. We can now look back at some of those spiritual bypassing beliefs. And I did a whole class called Spiritual Bypassing Recovery 101 to sort of unpack those beliefs one by one to find the oppression within them. But I'll read you a couple quotes. I found what I was looking for. This is John Wellwood. When we are spiritually bypassing, we often use the goal of awakening or liberation to rationalize what I call premature transcendence, trying to rise above the raw and messy side of our humanness before we have fully faced and made peace with it. And then we tend to use absolute truth to disparage or dismiss relative human needs, feelings, psychological problems, relational difficulties, and developmental deficits. I see this as an occupational hazard of the spiritual path. Trying to move beyond our psychological and emotional issues by sidestepping them is dangerous. It sets up a debilitating split between the Buddha and the human within us, and it leads to a conceptual one-sided kind of spirituality where one pole of life is elevated at the expense of its opposite. And I particularly love this phrase about blind compassion, which is another way of spiritual bypassing. This is from Robert Augustus Masters, who wrote the book Spiritual Bypassing. He said, blind compassion is rooted in the belief that we are all doing the best we can. When we are driven by blind compassion, we cut everyone far too much slack, making excuses for others' behavior and making nice situations that require a forceful no, an unmistakable voicing of displeasure, or a firm setting and maintaining of boundaries. These things can and often should be done out of love, but blind compassion keeps love too meek, sentenced to wearing a kind face. Blind compassion is kindness rooted in fear, and not just fear of confrontation, but also fear of not coming across as a good or spiritual person. When we're engaged in blind compassion, we rarely show anger, for we not only believe that compassion has to be gentle, we are also frightened of upsetting anyone, especially to the point of their confronting us. This is reinforced by our judgment about anger, especially in its more fiery forms, as something less than spiritual, something that shouldn't be there if we were truly being loving. Blind compassion reduces us to harmony junkies, entrapping us in unrelentingly positive expression. With blind compassion, we don't know how to or won't learn how to say no with any real power, avoiding confrontation at all costs, and as a result, enabling unhealthy patterns to continue. There's a whole section about that in my book, Sacred Medicine. I have a whole chapter about spiritual and religious bypassing, but those are just a couple little quotes that I like.
That second one was so powerful. But what snapped you out of that bliss time of yours, that honeymoon phase? What happened? Is there a story? Like, how did you realize that you were in this spiritual bypassing stage?
Well, I was in Bali for 2 months researching the chapter about Bali in my Sacred Medicine book when Trump was elected. And that was an ontological shock to my system, like it was to so many others. And adding that trauma on top of all the other childhood trauma and medical education trauma and, the trauma of my perfect storm, and then the collective trauma of, for the first time in my life, feeling like it would be dangerous to go back to my country. And my sister's Black. So the terror of realizing that my sister was now not safe in the country she was living in that pushed me over the edge. Like it just stopped working. Like my nervous system could no longer be settled by my spiritual practices. And then I went through another series of back-to-back traumas that ended with my mother dying. And that's what got me into therapy. But I was lucky in that 2016 happened. I found Robert Augustus Masters' book, Spiritual Bypassing. It absolutely shattered me. And I'm very careful when I'm talking to other people about spiritual bypassing, because you don't want to take away people's entire kind of coping system without replacing it with something. But I was very lucky that my cousin is an IFS therapist. And she said, Lissa, you need to learn IFS. It's a game changer. It's going to absolutely change your life. And I found IFS within weeks of reading that book. And it is absolutely the antidote. It is spirituality without bypassing. And so I was able to have like a spiritual bypassing off-ramp. And it was a very gentle and very loving and very settling off ramp, and I had a map, and I was like, okay, now we're doing this. And I knew it was going to be hard. And it has been the hardest thing I've ever done, harder than my medical training. Like, this is no joke. There's a reason people don't do it. And it's hard enough to face the ways that we've been victimized by traumas. But for me, the harder part is facing the ways that we've then been the perpetrator in similar ways or in the opposite ways of how we've been victimized. And it's really painful to sit in the discomfort of, just feeling all those feelings and learning to love all of our parts. And in internal family systems, for any of you who don't know what that is, it's based on the idea that the idea of the unified self is a myth, and that we're all a multiplicity of parts. And I always tell people, everybody can understand IFS because every single one of us has had a part that makes a New Year's resolution that like wants us to be better, like a self-improvement part. It wants us to lose weight or go to the gym or start a creative project or better ourselves in some way, right? And then we have the part that does the bad thing. Those are firefighter parts, we call them in IFS. And then we have the part that shames us for having broken the New Year's resolution, usually within weeks of making it. And then we loop that because all of those parts are on top of parts that carry intense burdens. They feel feelings that are really hard to feel, like worthlessness, helplessness, hopelessness, not feeling good enough, feeling ashamed, feeling disposable, feeling discarded, feeling not special, not chosen, not loved, not lovable, not enough. And so all of us have constellations of parts that try to prevent us from feeling that. And all of us have parts like that. Everybody. My adverse childhood experience score, the ACE score, that's one of the measures of, big T traumas. My ACE score is 0. But we all have developmental trauma in some way. We all are traumatized by the culture, by the systemic racism of the culture, by end stage capitalism, by climate crisis. Like, nobody is immune to having these parts. And so the beauty of the model is that the whole point, if there's a point of healing, is to attach those hurt inner children to the wise divine self. I call it your inner pilot light. They call it self with a capital S in IFS. You could call it Buddha nature or Christ consciousness or whatever you want to call it, Captain Crunch. We all have our names for that loving, compassionate, curious, calm, confident, clear, divine self. And that is the inner healer, the inner teacher, the inner doctor, the inner therapist, the inner spiritual teacher that never goes away. And everybody has it, and it cannot be damaged. So finding a spiritual path that gives us a way to connect to the, if you will, the God inside, we're finding that antidote right after the shattering of 2016 was perfect timing for me. And so I have, been teaching IFS with the founder of IFS, Richard Schwartz. I've been teaching it mostly to healthcare providers and therapists and people who are chronically ill and have a trauma history that might be underlying their physical symptoms.
I had Dick Schwartz on the podcast, and he did IFS with me. And it was truly powerful. And with that one session, which some of the listeners said it didn't make sense to listen to someone else's session, but it was truly healing for me. And I can tell you, Lissa, that the problem that I brought up to that session completely disappeared after just one session. And I felt the power.
Then you answered your own question, right? How do you know if healing is working? It's like the same trigger that would normally make the song and dance happens again, only it's neutralized. It's not that you don't feel it. It's not that it goes away. It's not that you forget, but it's neutralized. You don't have that same automatic responsive trigger. And when you start doing a lot of that, it absolutely changes your life. I did an amazing session with Dick Schwartz about 3 years ago. I was in a relationship and my partner left me very unexpectedly on Christmas and for somebody else. And I could not stop crying, and I was overwhelmed and flooded. And I couldn't pull it together. And I called Dick Schwartz and I was like, help, it's a holiday. My therapist is off, and he was, bless his heart, he was like, okay, let's work with what's going on. And of course, I had a legitimate reason to be upset that my partner had just left me for another woman. But what was coming up was this 2-year-old part that was just losing her shit because I had just been replaced. I was the first child. I had just been replaced by my brother. And the first time I saw my brother on my mother's breast when I was still breastfeeding, and that was my boob. And I was used to being centered. I was used to being, mommy's little baby. And now all of a sudden, here's this little other baby that's now mommy's little baby. And I'm supposed to just not be triggered. And when I got enraged and terrified and full of grief, then I was told that these were not appropriate emotions for a good little Christian girl. And I should be excited about my new baby brother. And so we just did it's called an unburdening in IFS, a whole tearful redo of that part that just felt replaced, disposable, discarded, not chosen, not special, all those exile feelings. And then you go in and you redo the scene. You say, what should have happened? And sometimes the parts want you to get rid of the brother and let the baby nurse the mother. And this little 2-year-old part, it had no interest in my mother or my brother. It wanted to breastfeed me, the sort of mother of my own parts. And it was just this most beautiful reunion. And when we do that, we have a way of sort of doing what we call memory reconsolidation in the trauma field, where when we have those memories and we're feeling all those feelings, those neural pathways are labile, they open up. And then we can have a restorative experience that actually repatterns the neuroplasticity and builds a new, instead of having a super highway that the trigger comes in, the song and dance happens, we can cut the tripwire and we can actually implant a new memory. Now, instead of feeling replaced, disposable, discarded, not centered, now we've neutralized that experience. And a year later, my best friend, who I was used to talking to every day, and I would see her every weekend, she got a new boyfriend and moved to Denver in the middle of the pandemic. And I did not make it about me. I did not make it that there's something wrong with me. I'm discarded. I'm not special. I'm not chosen. I'm decentered. I was decentered. She did prioritize him. I lost a lot of her. We're still very close friends, but it changed the dynamic. But I did not have that sort of narcissistic injury of making it all about me. I was able to actually be really happy for my friend and really supportive and excited and work with my own parts to navigate the transition lovingly with my friend. So that's what I mean. You see that the behavior changes. And it's really beautiful because it's also so self-loving. We talk about self or self-compassion, but how do you love the parts of you that act out and do painful things? Or how do you love the parts of you that cause you to be overwhelmed and collapsed on the floor in tears? So this to me is the how of self-love and self-compassion. It's a very systematized map. It's not easy to do, but it's easy to understand.
What are energy transfusions?
Well, in sacred medicine, because I spent 10 years traveling the world, trying to understand healing. And it took me to working with shamans in Peru and Qigong masters from China and Balinese healers. And I realized at some point, these energy healers and shamans and all, they're actually doing trauma work, but many of them are doing it kind of badly. It's sort of messy. And they don't have licenses and they don't have boards regulating them and they don't have good boundaries and things like that. And so I thought, but people were having some really amazing experiences. And so I thought, I wonder what would happen if I actually went and worked with cutting edge trauma therapists, which is what led me into that work. But what I realized is that these energy healers and faith healers and spiritual counselors and shamans and indigenous healers, they were doing some beautiful work in that actually doing the really hard, painful trauma therapy is not something that some people are capable of doing right away. So, I came to think of it as sort of two general categories, that when people are burned out, when they're severely traumatized, the way many of us are after COVID, when they're really not resourced, like I'll ask people on a scale of 0 to 10, like, how resourced are you right now? Like, if 10 is like, I am so resourced, I can do the most difficult trauma work, like throw anything at me and I'm resilient and I can handle it. And 0 is like, I cannot even get out of bed, right? Like, I can't stop crying. I can't feel. I'm numb. I'm dissociated. I'm that. So where are people? And if people are on the like 5 to 10 scale, then that's a good time to do some of the more difficult trauma therapy. But if they're on the 0 to 5 scale, I think of it like if somebody comes I'm a doctor, so I think in medical metaphors, but I think of it like if someone comes into the emergency room and they are anemic, they don't have enough blood. Your hemoglobin is supposed to be like 13 or 14 and their hemoglobin is 6, right? They're anemic on blood. Then the first thing you do is you give them blood. You give them a blood transfusion because you need to tank them up. And then it would be, and that's helpful. They're going to feel better right away. But you wouldn't just send them home. That would be medical malpractice. You need to then diagnose, why are they leaking? Maybe they're losing blood from somewhere. Maybe there's something wrong with the bone marrow. They're not making blood cells. Maybe they have leukemia. Something is wrong with the blood. We need to figure out why they're anemic. And so I think of it the same way. I think when people are really under-resourced, these energy transfusion kinds of practices, they would be spiritual bypassing practices if we did not then figure out why people are leaking. Why are they anemic? But it can be helpful to kind of tank people up until they're more resourced. And so I think of a lot of these sort of energy healing, yoga, movement practices, intentional creativity, which Shiloh Sophia does, like art therapy, doing some of the rituals, going to pilgrimage sites like Lourdes. Like, there's some beautiful restorative practices. For me, like, I live in heaven, I live in paradise. So going out in nature, doing rituals out in nature, movement practices, these kinds of things are very transfusing, very resourcing, and they can build us up so that we can have more, so our nervous systems can tolerate doing some of the more difficult trauma work, which can be dysregulating. So I like to think of it as sort of like being like whales. Like, we need to like be up on the surface, splashing around, getting some oxygen, playing with the other whales. Like, those energy transfusions can help us do that. And then we have to go down to the bottom and do the deep dive. And then being able to recognize, okay, that's enough. I need to come back to the surface and get another breath and splash around. So I now still use a lot of those practices that, were part of my bliss hunting phase, but I don't use them to ignore my trauma work. I use them to support my trauma work.
And what does the trauma work entail then? If someone is listening, like, what does it entail? You mentioned already IFS. What else would you recommend?
Well, the field of traumatology is absolutely exploding right now. So and it's relatively new field. So we're still trying to actually figure this out. And there's a beautiful paper that came out by Kim Golding in 2015, and she made a pyramid called the therapeutic needs hierarchy, which basically sort of shows that from the bottom of the pyramid, the first thing you need to do in order to treat trauma is to feel safe emotionally and physically. And then you need to be able to have relationships that help you to heal. And then you need to be able to actually get comfort and co-regulation from those relationships, including a therapeutic relationship with a therapist if you can afford one. And you need to be able to get empathy and reflection, to have somebody else attuned to you and express empathy for what you've been through. And then you need to be able to actually like celebrate your resilience, like to not just make it what's wrong with me, but what's right about me. Like, look what I've been through, look what I've survived, and how did I resource myself so that, we can sort of develop self-esteem in that way. And then at the very top is exploring the actual trauma. That's where we go into the stories, and we do that memory reconsolidation process that we were talking about, where we rebuild those new pathways, and we even make meaning out of our trauma, right? Many of us, when we go through a trauma healing journey, or even like a physical healing journey, from a cancer journey, for example, we're able to look back on it and actually have gratitude for what we went through, not as a bypass, but because it was a growth opportunity for us. We became more of ourselves. We became more sensitive and empathic to others. Maybe we've changed. We're different after we go through something like COVID. Our culture is different. We as individuals are different. Some of us are still in shock and have not gone through that.
But you're not saying things happen for a reason,
exactly.
Right?
We're not saying my soul chose this or everything happens. We're saying it happened. What meaning can we make out of it? And how do we neutralize those memories by replacing them with what should have happened in the sort of inner world? And there are lots of different ways of doing this. I like internal family systems. I like somatic experiencing, which Peter Levine has developed. I like neuroaffective relational model, which Lawrence Heller has developed. I like advanced integrative therapy, which is in kind of related to tapping, but a more advanced form of energy psychology. And then, there are all the sort of energy healing modalities as well that are many of them indigenous traditions, so there are many of them. Like I said, I literally took a survey on Facebook at one point and made a list of like 200 different copyrighted, sort of branded trauma healing modalities. So I have my favorites, but I certainly have not been trained in all of them. I've been trained in the ones that I named.
No, I of course, yeah, I get that. But it is good that you talked about this and enlisted different modalities. So we know that stress and trauma cause physical illness. But does that mean healing our trauma, we can cure ourselves of a disease? I want you to talk about that. I mean, there is, of course, usefulness to healing our trauma, right?
Yeah, well, I certainly am always careful when I talk. I've been teaching about internal family systems as a way to treat the traumas that can predispose us to medical conditions. And we know with the data is very, very clear. So I won't go over it right now, but it's in Sacred Medicine. I went through, if you have any doubt that trauma causes disease, there is no doubt in the scientific literature now. Trauma causes most disease, not all disease. Some diseases are caused by external traumas, like if you live next to a toxic waste dump, or if you were born with 2 copies of a recessive gene. But the majority of the diseases that bring people to the doctor are related to emotional and physical and psychological and spiritual trauma. So what we know is trauma causes disease. What we don't have the data to really prove is that treating trauma with cutting edge trauma therapies reverses disease. We have a lot of anecdotes. And I, along with my romantic partner, I have been studying spontaneous remission for more than a decade. He's the head of the psych hospital at Harvard, and he's been studying spontaneous remission since 2003, very, very rigorously. He wrote a book called Cured. And both of us talk about this all the time. And the number one thing that both of us have found, and Kelly Turner also has been studying this and published her findings in the book Radical Remission. All 3 of us have talked about this. And the number one thing that I believe, I'll speak for myself, the number one thing that I believe underlies those remarkable remissions where people are health outliers and they have a better than usual outcome from a disease that doctors have deemed incurable, either without medical treatment or with treatment deemed to be inadequate for cure, is they do hardcore deep dive into their trauma healing journey. And they literally become they change their whole sense of who they are in the world. Their identity shifts. and they create a new story about themselves through that process. And they go about it all different ways. They also, change their diet and they exercise and they do other good things, but that's the most consistent thing. And so we have lots of anecdotes of people who refused medical treatment, for example, and went on a healing journey and had their traumas treated and were cured. We can't ever say, what is the thing that did the cure? Because we can't control for those things. They're also doing all kinds of other things. So it would be unethical to say that it was treating the trauma that created the cure, because they're also changing their diet and they're eating vegetarian and they're taking 10 supplements and they're, breaking up with their toxic marriage and quitting their toxic job and making all kinds of lifestyle changes as well. But, what we can say with pretty good evidence is that untreated trauma, if somebody has a chronic or incurable or terminal disease, untreated trauma causes the nervous system to be chronically dysregulated, putting it into a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. That chronic dysregulation impacts the immune system, disables the immune system, causes chronic inflammation. We know with good data that chronic inflammation is linked to almost every disease. It impacts the microbiome. It makes the body's natural self-healing mechanisms, because we all make cancer cells every day. We all fight cancer every day. We're all exposed to different pathogens and we fight off those pathogens every day. But if the nervous system is dysregulated, we cannot do that. Our bodies are busy trying to escape the threat, and they're not busy repairing what breaks down in the body. So if we are able, the goal of trauma therapy is to regulate the nervous system. That is the main goal, to go from either a sympathetic fight or flight stress response or a dorsal vagal freeze or fawn collapsed, like, the gazelle dropping before it's caught by the tiger, which is the most severe type of stress response. So those stress responses, we can't fight illness. So when we treat our traumas, what we know is that through neuroplasticity and building those new neural pathways, we can actually regulate the nervous system and make it much more stabilized. And when we do that, the body's natural self-repair mechanisms can do what they do. Now, whether or not they can completely reverse the disease depends on so many other factors that we don't know how to predict that at this point. But personally, I think it's medical malpractice to prescribe for somebody an oncology treatment plan, for example, without including treating the parts that dysregulated the nervous system in the first place, to make the body vulnerable to being overtaken by the cancer. So I'm a big fan of both, and I've never said, do trauma treatment instead of conventional medical treatment. I say do both. And that's what I would do if I were to become sick. Is I'm already doing the trauma treatment, so I would also be going to the medical doctor. And I would also be doing those energy transfusion practices to try to stabilize and regulate and resource myself.
The holistic approach, right? It's a holistic approach. So I want to ask you about your dog bite incident, because then I want to ask you about the whole body intelligences. Are you okay with sharing that story?
Yeah. Well, I was walking up to the overlook where I live to watch the sunrise one morning, taking my dog for a walk. And I was sitting there talking to this other guy who had a pit bull on a leash, restrained, and we were just enjoying the sunset. And all of a sudden, the dog struck me like a snake, like completely unprovoked, just lashed out and grabbed a chunk of my thigh. And the dog's owner was like fighting with on the leash to try to pull him off. And the dog took a chunk out of my thigh about this big, about 6 inches by 4 inches and about 1.5 inches to 2 inches deep, right above my femoral artery. I was glad I have a little bit of fat there, because if I had been any skinnier, it probably would have killed me, because we're a good 45 minutes from the closest hospital, and I would have just bled out on the scene most likely. So this was a terrifying moment, right? And you're in shock. And so here's this moment, the dog's owner, who's this young guy, was terrified. He's like, what do I do? What do I do? Do I call 911? Do I put you in the car? Do I take you to the hospital? Like, he's so terrified. And I had this, when we're in, some of you who have been in emergency situations know that when we're in an emergency situation is sometimes when we can hear our clearest guidance, just the most directly. It's like something comes through. And it was just very clear to me. I just started giving him instructions. I said, drive me to my house. We were right close to where I lived. Drive me to my house. Help me get out of these pants. Put me in the bathtub. Let me handle this. And he was like, what? And I was like, just do what I say. So he did. He helped me get to my house. And again, I tell people listening, I did not go to the hospital, but I am a doctor and I knew exactly what I was doing. So I would not do this at home. But I had a part that was thinking the most dangerous place for me to be right now when I have an open, dirty wound with a dog bite, which is a dirty wound because all the bacteria, is an emergency room full of antibiotic resistant bacteria. Like, the biggest risk in a situation like that is infection. And I knew they weren't going to be able to close it. It was too big a hole. So, and I wasn't bleeding enough to be worried about blood loss. It was just oozing. So I went and I put myself in the bathtub. And the first thing I did is call my best friend, who's an emergency room physician. And I sent him a photo and I said, I'm intuiting that I don't think I'm supposed to go to the emergency room. Do you think that's an acceptable option? And he said, yes, let me help you. We can do this from home. He called in an antibiotic for me. He told me I needed to go get a tetanus shot. He told me to make an appointment with a surgeon within 24 hours. But he said the most important thing is first, you need to get that shower head on your bathtub and put it in your wound. It's going to hurt like hell, and leave it there for a good minute and lavage the crap out of it. And so I did that. I called for help. I called for support, for emotional and physical support, because I didn't want to have to do it to myself. And while I was waiting for the support, I called all of the people that I called the best people that I had been working with for my sacred medicine research to call in my team. Like, it's in my book, Mind Over Medicine, I talk about the 6 steps to healing yourself. And part of it is creating your healing roundtable. So I was really clear. I needed to treat the trauma of this. I didn't want to get a dog phobia. I love dogs. I didn't want to start avoiding the overlook. I didn't want to have, severe PTSD as a result of this. I called the energy healer who was like sending me remote energy healing work. I called my friend who is an Crow tribe indigenous medicine man. He's like, we need to get some bear root on it right away. Like, I called and made an appointment with the surgeon. The surgeon looked at the wound and said, there's no way this is closing on its own. You're going to need multiple skin grafts and multiple surgeries over the course of the year. And I just knew when she said that is not the way we're going to do it. And so, long story short, the wound closed completely. I had the support of a wound care doctor who respected my boundary not to do surgery and decided, she's like, well, I don't know how this is going to go, but I'm going to give you everything else that's not surgery. And it took about 4 months and it closed completely and has a beautiful outcome. And so I started teaching about what I called the whole health intelligences, which is intuitive intelligence, mental intelligence, emotional intelligence, and somatic intelligence. And if we want to make good snap decisions when we're in emergency situations, or if we have a medical issue and we have to decide about our treatment plans, we don't want to just use our mental intelligence. We want to, hear the statistics, listen to the experts, read the studies, practice evidence-based medicine, all of that. That is all valid. We don't want to discard that. A lot of the people that I met in the sacred medicine world, they don't care about science at all. And that is not a good idea. We need to follow the science. But we'd be missing out if we were not also paying attention to our intuitive, emotional, and somatic intelligence. And I talk extensively about how to do that in the book.
Yeah, because sometimes there is a conflict, right? Your mental intuition says, go do this. Are you crazy not to go to the best doctor? Or if you are someone who is traumatized, like many of us, one of the signs is you disconnect from your intuition, right? So that could be very hard to orchestrate that. But it sounds like you had done a lot of work. So all of those intelligences worked very, very well in your favor. So does the distant energy healing work?
Does it work? Well, I actually, you know what? I'm not going to answer that question because I'm looking at the time. I don't have time to answer that question in the amount of time that we have. So I will say that the science is not good.
The science is not good.
There is science, but it's not good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, Lissa, I want to ask you, would you be open to coming again to the podcast? Because you're such a wealth of information and knowledge and a great storyteller and down to earth. Would you be willing to do part 2 at some point? Not necessarily tomorrow.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Okay, good. So, and the last question I have for you, I know we're pressed for time today, the paradoxes of healing, which I love that you talk about that in your book. Maybe just share the paradoxes of healing with a bit of an overview, not necessarily like a deep dive since we don't have time.
Well,
I think that would be a great place
I
to
was really
end.
shocked during the pandemic because I was always aware from the time Mind Over Medicine came out 10 years ago. I've been aware that there are really 2 polarized camps when it comes to health and healing and conventional medicine. There's like the materialist scientist, hardcore medicine. And then there's the sort of new age, natural healing. We don't care about science. Like my body knows what to do. And they're very polarized and they fight with each other. And I was like, guys, like get together. This is not either or. This is, you're both right and you're both wrong. And then during COVID, it became even more clear. You had the follow public health guidelines. And then you had the just eat your vegetables and take your supplements. Like it was like, no, follow public health guidelines and eat your vegetables and take your supplements, right? So anyway, here's my paradoxes of healing. And what I tell people is if you're only spouting half of the truth, you're all wrong. So you can heal yourself and you can't do it alone. Conventional medicine can save lives, and conventional medicine is the 3rd highest cause of death in the US. That's no longer true. Now it's COVID. Keep an open mind and don't be so open your brains fall out. Be clear in your intention to heal and surrender attachment to outcomes. Trust your intuition and follow the science and apply critical thinking. Believe in magic and miracles and avoid indulging in magical thinking and denial. Be proactive about taking back your power and go with the flow. Your disease is not your fault, and your healing journey is your responsibility. Lead with your heart and use your head. Be guided by germ theory and terrain theory. Your thoughts influence reality, and your thoughts cannot control reality. Seek pain relief and feel your pain. We are not our bodies, our emotions, or our identities, and we are all of those things. There's more of them. But just to give you an idea, to me, that not every polarization can be resolved with a paradox, right? Like we're not going to say Black Lives Matter and white supremacy is so cool, right? Like, no, there's only one right side of history when it comes to civil rights and systems of oppression. But when it comes to health and healing, a lot of times the polarized parties are both right and both wrong because they're not sort of sharing the whole paradox.
Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I truly enjoyed this conversation. I had so much to say, but I'm going to let you go with the hope that we can do round 2. There is so much that I want to get out of you. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to do part 2. Thanks for caring about what I'm doing. And thank you all, those of you who are listening. Thank you for being brave enough. Some of this material can be kind of triggering for people. So I just want to remind anybody who feels unsettled by any of this. We just covered a lot really quickly. So just like I'm putting my hands on my heart and make sure that you stay resourced and go take a walk and take a few deep breaths and just settle yourself if any of that was dysregulating.
Oh, thank you. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a walk.
Okay,
thank you.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What's your biggest takeaway? Did you find it useful? How can you apply what you gleaned from this episode into your life? I love hearing from you. I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. If you enjoy the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Your ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. So get to it. If you want to join your fellow listeners from around the world and engage in meaningful conversation about the show, get support and answers to your parenting questions, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for parents just like you. Do you love the podcast and find it helpful? Show your support by becoming a patron on patreon.com. To learn more, go to patreon.com/authentic parenting. Again, patreon.com/authentic parenting and choose a level of support. With a small monthly contribution, you can make a big difference. Join other active members who believe and support the work of authentic parenting. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and elsewhere. And finally, if you want to know what I'm up to in my private life, see behind the scenes of podcasting, get inspiration, and just stay connected, follow me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.